Welcome. We are here talking with Dave Redlawsk, who is now at the University of Delaware. And thank you so much for that great background, University of Delaware.
It's better than my house.
And had previously been at the University of Iowa and was just here this fall working, and also with his colleague from the University of Iowa, Carolyn Tolbert. We just had a whole Colbert conversation.
Sorry.
So both these folks are in political science and think and write and work a lot in the area of elections. And so I think we're going to have a lot of opportunity to jump in there. But Dave, we were talking about some of your work over the years on, I think you said, motivated reasoning and just how that's showing up right now.
So for a while now, scholars have been looking at this question about why are people often impervious to new information. You know, we believe something, new information appears, we ignore it, and we just keep on believing what we believe. This happens a lot in politics. And one of the reasons we think it happens is this idea of motivated reasoning, more specifically, directional motivated reasoning. That is, being motivated to maintain an existing evaluation. It's hard to change when we believe something. We like to think we're right. We've invested in it emotionally. We've invested in it psychologically. So when things challenge our beliefs, it turns out that we're pretty good at ignoring them or rationalizing them away, or in other ways, simply maintaining our beliefs in the face of sometimes even really clear challenges to those beliefs. And so looking at where we are right now with COVID-19, with partisanship in the United States being at intensely polarized and even negative, one of the factors involved in this may well be our tendencies to be not open to new information. So as a practical matter, we're seeing this in the current situation. Pew just put out a report. They did a large-scale survey asking people about support for government, support for how things are going, and also their own fears, their own concerns about the coronavirus situation. And what we find is tremendous partisan polarization. It's really odd in a way to think a disease is being polarized, but it's that Republicans are less worried about it, are believing things that they're hearing in their environments that it's not so bad or it won't be so bad, and it's really just a plot or something to make the president look bad. Democrats are more worried about it. Democrats are more likely to believe there's a serious issue. But remember, they also don't like Donald Trump. So to some degree, believing coronavirus is a problem and Trump is part of the problem makes Democrats feel like, yeah, that's what I believe. What's really interesting, though, is that some years ago, in 2010, Andy Civittini, Karen Emerson, who was a student of mine, actually, at Iowa while I was there, and I published a paper that suggests that when threat increases, that motivated reasoning process reduces, and people become more accurate in their assessments. And that's exactly what the Pew report seems to show. In areas of the country where the virus has been particularly nasty, where the numbers have gone way up in terms of infections and deaths, polarization around the issue virtually disappears. Republicans and Democrats both believe it's a serious problem, are both very concerned about it. And that's exactly what we expect. That is that, once you see it for yourself and it actually becomes a threat, in this case, an existential threat for people, we seem to be able to overcome some of those inherent defenses against changing our minds. I'm finding the real world application is fascinating because the work I did was in the laboratory. And, it's kind of nice, I suppose. I should be careful saying nice, but it's kind of nice to see things we find in the laboratory happening out actually in the real world.
I'm imagining this laboratory of just like sticking voters in a white room.
We put them in front of computers, to be
yeah.
honest. Even worse, I think.
Yeah, and Carolyn, you were reflecting on how some of this is showing up with what we're seeing with governors right now.
Yeah, in subnational politics, we've actually, governors are often much less visible than the president and members of Congress, and we have seen a resurgence of federalism and a resurgence of the states taking the lead in declaring emergency orders, closing schools, closing businesses, banning large gatherings, and stay-at-home, different forms of stay-at-home orders that vary quite dramatically across the state, and other policies. Now, policies to help businesses and people who are unemployed. The economic fallout of COVID-19 is going to be very significant, and we are in an unfolding story. So what's super interesting is some of the reports just showing the historic high levels of approval of governors, and governors come with party labels. And so this means Democrats in Iowa that have higher approval for Kim Reynolds than what may have been before COVID-19, and Republicans in a state like California, where Newsom is the Democratic governor. So that same phenomena that Dave was talking about, we're also seeing in terms of kind of this rally around the governor's effect that we are seeing across the states.
Political scientists have been really, really worried about this intense polarization over the last few years and what it means for the system. And in some ways, what Carolyn just talked about and what we're seeing in those Pew data is absolutely fascinating, because we're seeing real reductions in that polarization, but in very specific ways, right? In the Pew data, it's for people who are living in places that are particularly hard hit. So reality is just saying you can't believe what you used to believe. In Carolyn's examples with the governors, some of this is that, and it doesn't seem to matter if it's a governor who locked down the state, like Cuomo in New York, or like Kim Reynolds in Iowa, who has not done so. They're seeing that uptick in support, which is a reduction in that kind of partisan polarization. The question will be if it holds when this is over. A lot of this right now really is about threat. But on the other side of the coin, President Trump's rally around the flag effect was minuscule, and it's disappeared. With George Bush and 9/11, Bush went from basically underwater in approval to massively popular right afterwards, because everyone came together. That has not happened with Donald Trump. The polarization remains there, but not with the governors.
And what do you both see in terms of his fight, what seems to be kind of a fight with the governors?
Carolyn, you mentioned federalism.
But he, in some ways, he's really been giving the governors the lead. By not acting in a coordinated national kind of plan, he has given the governors the power. And in politics, in the world of politics, power is the most important resource. And he has given it to the governors. And now what we're seeing are these fascinating discussions of the governors making coalitions, deciding when and how to open up the economy and on what benchmarks need to be met. I was fascinated to read that Kim Reynolds in Iowa had not only reached out to Nebraska, but to the Dakotas, to Missouri, to Illinois, the governors of all of these neighboring states. And we've seen a pact between the governors in Oregon and Washington and California. We're seeing this in the Northeast. So in some ways, remember, we were 13 colonies that came together and voluntarily created the Union in 1787. And that strength of our system, that we have both this federal system power at the state level and power at the national level, I think that's good. I don't think a one-size-fits-all solution is the answer. And recovery, the economic recovery that we are going to have to start down. We can read the news. Disney World laid off, furloughed without pay, 43,000 people, effective April 19th, I think. That's the size of Iowa City, with maybe just add another 20,000. It's a lot of people with no health insurance, with no food, with no jobs. So anyway,
Well,
it could take a lot of federalism.
well, right, and the other thing that this has done has created, Congress passed an historic stimulus bill, recovery bill, whatever you want to call the bill, $2 trillion unanimously in the Senate, and all but one member of the House of Representatives. That's amazing. I mean, the kinds of things that the parties have fought over for a generation. For the moment, everyone is more or less on the same page. The federal government needs to stimulate the economy, needs to do massive things, but we're not getting the kind of historic coordination expected from the federal government on the disaster relief side, on the practical side. And the governors have stepped up to do that. Trump himself, what I think is really fascinating is, in a sense, when he said, "I'm not responsible," he did exactly what Carolyn said. He essentially said to the governors, do whatever it is. But then a few days ago, in response to, I guess, some negative stories about this, he tried to assert that he was actually in charge. He's not, in the way that he asserted it, not under the Constitution. But it's fascinating to watch that dynamic, but to realize in the end, in a way I would have never expected, that's a sideshow. The real work is going on at the state and local level in a way that I don't think we've seen in a long time.
Mm-hmm. So moving to some conversation about the elections. So Dave, you were here in the fall going to caucuses and many, you said like 135.
I saw about 135 candidate speeches.
And God bless you, yes. And Carolyn,
I'm still recovering.
You have a book coming out about voting specifically. So as we look ahead toward the conventions and toward next fall, what are you both seeing as possible ways that this could go in terms of dealing with our presidential election process at this really fragile time?
Do you want to start with
stuff on mail voting and things like that? It's so relevant.
Well, I could just briefly say, so before COVID, we wrote a book that was, it's forthcoming with Oxford University Press, and my co-author is Michael Ritter. He's at Washington State University in Pullman, an Iowa PhD, a former Iowa PhD. And the book is called Accessible Elections, and it's coming out with Oxford University Press. And it basically explores the wide variation across the states in what we call convenience voting methods, or ways to modernize and update how we conduct elections. It looks specifically at rules that allow no excuse absentee voting, mail ballots, all mail elections, in-person early voting, and same-day registration. And it leverages the National Commercial Voter Rolls, so it doesn't use survey data. It's based on the voter rolls. And so it's a very large sample, millions of respondents. And the real benefit of it is that it includes vote histories. So we're able to see who voted in the past and specifically model what makes somebody go from being a non-voter to become a voter. And this, for us in the world of data, that's a panel. And panels give us better leverage on making causal arguments. And what we find is contrary, there was quite a bit of a published research showing that same-day registration had positive benefits, but what our research actually shows is that early voting and mail and absentee voting can also, in different contexts, have very positive benefits in increasing voter turnout, i.e. these laws work, and the states are paving the way already before COVID in using these laws and helping to mobilize turnout. We go further. We look at turnout in midterm and presidential elections, but we also focus in on subsamples of only poor people, people who live at the federal poverty level or below. And we also look at turnout for different racial and ethnic groups, Latinos, African Americans, Asians. And what we find is that these laws in different ways help these disadvantaged groups as well. So obviously, Wisconsin just had a highly controversial primary where at the 11th hour, the Supreme Court ruled that the primary had to be held in person. My husband is very into podcasting. He told me stories about 3 lines of voters. Voters who didn't have COVID, voters who did have COVID, and voters who might have COVID. Could you imagine publicly exposing to your community any one of those lines? I think that seems to violate a HIPAA law. Maybe I'm wrong. But so I think it was a very public lesson about this is not how we want to conduct elections. And I think there's quite a bit of evidence that mail and absentee voting works. Early voting in person works and is widely used. And you could imagine using social distancing and having that work to avoid election day crowds. Not all states have these. In Iowa, Kim Reynolds, a Republican governor, announced that absentee mail ballots would be mailed to every voter for the July primary here in Iowa. So I'll let Dave follow up. But an interesting time let's modernize how we conduct elections.
It is. I think Wisconsin, I think the report now is 70 to 75% of all the ballots that were cast by mail. And that doesn't count the ones that were too late. Right, and it's some indication this can be done. They really weren't prepared for it. They essentially got a week to organize it after the actual election, but they typically only have about 15% absentee or mail ballots. So it's a huge shift, and I think we'll see more of that. My interest, having spent 6 months in Iowa watching those caucus campaigns and seeing, I think, about 147 candidates, it felt like, something like that, it was crazy, is the campaign itself. We don't know what campaigns look like if you can't campaign, if you can't hold rallies, if your supporters can't knock on doors, if you can't do the traditional get out the vote efforts, whether it's by voting by mail or not. One of the really important things campaigns do is mobilize volunteers, not just on the telephone, but to actually go to doors and make sure people get their ballots and send them in and all the rest of that. We don't know how long our current lockdown is going to last, but how do campaigns work in this environment? There's been a lot about campaigns going online over the last 20 years, and sure they have, particularly the fundraising side. But in the end, I'm firmly convinced that online campaigning just doesn't generate the enthusiasm that research shows is needed to get people to actually vote. You can provide information, you can remind them about things, but the linkage to actually get people out still has to do with the fact we're social creatures. And the fact that, we're used to seeing candidate rallies and the crowds and the excitement, and all of that excitement has its way of generating enthusiasm and positive emotions. Carolyn and I, some years ago, as Barack Obama was being elected the first time, did some research on negative emotions and positive emotions, negative emotions, and racial resentment. And what we found was that even among people who were particularly negative on racial indicators, if somehow the Obama campaign generated even some sense of hope or enthusiasm, it greatly reduced the likelihood of them opposing Obama. The positive emotions don't get studied a lot in political psychology, political science, but I think we're going to learn how important they are in this kind of an environment.
Mm-hmm. And before we close, Carolyn, I just want to ask you for a moment to tell us a little bit about your work with broadband and how you see this fitting in to what's happening right now as we're all sequestered, as well as to recovery.
Yeah. And I know Dave knows that Karen Mossberger, who's at Arizona State University, and I have been studying the digital divide for 20 years. We study broadband subscriptions, and not just do we know that people who are poor and are the most likely to not have access. In fact, poverty and different forms of being poor are the biggest predictors. It used to be older people, but that has really changed. But we measure it by geographic areas. So by counties, by metros, by zip codes, by census tracts, by states, and over time. It's hard to believe that the digital revolution is only 20 years old, really. It was in 2000 that we started. This government started measuring broadband subscriptions. At the time, about 5% of the population was online. Today, estimates vary, but a conservative estimate is that there's over 20 million Americans who don't have high-speed access. Most people's broadband is not even fast enough to do these Zoom calls. And Bill Gates just put out a report that 160 million Americans do not have internet access at speeds that are what the FCC calls high speed.
That's nearly half the country.
Half the country.
Amazing.
And so it is when we talk about different types of inequalities built into the system, and then we put something like COVID-19 on top of it, those who have high-speed access, live in areas with connected populations, are able to continue their kids' schooling, are able to continue working remotely, are able to visit with their friends and family and keep their emotional, levels up. And I was reading a wonderful article in the Washington Post about what they call the education catastrophe. And it was about in Baltimore school districts, only 1 in 4 children have a computer with high-speed access. In the LA school districts, 25% of children hadn't logged on to campus at all. They estimated that the children in this cohort will get 50% of the math they needed for the year and 70% of the English language skills that they needed for the year. And that's not talking about the economy or jobs or online businesses. So we are interested and are working on trying to study how to help the nation moving forward. Zoom stock is an example.
That's fascinating and worthy of a much longer conversation. I know there was an article last week in the New York Times looking at college students who felt relatively equal on campus, and now they're home and they have incredibly different. Yeah, very similar. Exactly. Thank you both so much for your time. Really appreciate it.
You bet. Thanks for having me.